All right, so get this. We are going deep today, deep into this spiritual organization. They've got like a few names.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The Science of Identity Foundation, the Chaitanya Mission,
Yeah.
even just mantra.pl. And you know what? This is going to be good.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
All right, so we've got all this stuff like academic research on cults.
Whoa.
Yeah, and like firsthand stories from people who used to be members, and get this, even connections to some big-time political figures.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like a total mix, and I don't know, it's kind of a rabbit hole, but like a fun one.
I could already tell this is going to be juicy.
So, okay, to like set the scene, we've got all these sources about cults, right? And experts like Galaner and Lifton, they like define some key characteristics to look out for.
Right.
Things like thought reform and psychological manipulation, like spy stuff.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But here's what gets me. Lalich and Tobias, they wrote this book, Captive Hearts, Captive Minds.
Oh, yeah.
And they use this phrase, captive hearts and captive minds.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is. And it like makes you think, how does a group go from giving spiritual guidance to being so controlling?
It's a slippery slope, isn't it? That's where I think the idea of like a deteriorating spiritual system comes in.
Okay, yeah. Tell me more about that.
So we have this excerpt. It's from Cults and Deteriorated Spiritual Systems. It basically says that even teachings that start with good intentions can like become so rigid, so dogmatic.
Right.
It's like they lose the spirit of the teaching and just focus on the rules. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And then the leader becomes like this godlike figure, right?
Exactly. And then there's often this hostility towards anyone outside the group.
It's like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it can be.
Which brings us to like the Science of Identity Foundation and this guy, Chris Butler, also known as Jagadguru Siddhaswarupananda Paramahamsa.
Okay.
I know, right? The name.
Sounds a mouthful.
So we've got Butler, we've got his group, and then in the Flashlight and Roaches database and these EXIF members' posts, there are some surprising names in there. People listed as disciples or children of this group.
Like who?
Well, get this, Tulsi Gabbard.
No way.
Yeah, former U.S. representative, even ran for president.
That's wild. How does someone like her get mixed up in something like this?
It's crazy, right? It's like, what's the appeal?
Well, there's this concept called Guru Tattva that's mentioned a lot in the sources.
Okay, so what is Guru Tattva exactly?
It's basically the philosophy and the, principles about the role of a guru in spiritual traditions.
Oh, okay.
But here's the thing. In SIF, they seem to keep information about Guru Tattva really hush-hush.
Really?
Yeah, it's like they're hiding something.
What do you think they're trying to hide? Like, are they afraid people will question Butler if they knew more about Guru Tattva?
It's possible,
Yeah.
By controlling what people know about Guru Tattva, they control how people see Butler.
Ah, I see.
And it kind of ties into the criticisms from our Polish sources. They say Butler's a hypocrite.
Really?
Yeah, they say he doesn't live by his own teachings.
Yeah, like how so?
Well, they point to his wealth, for example. He owns this whole chain of health food stores down to earth.
Ah, interesting.
And he's married, which goes against the traditional vows of sannyasa, a life of renunciation, which he preaches about.
Wow. Great. Okay, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is. It makes you wonder how someone can preach one thing and then do another, and how his followers just go along with it.
Yeah, especially given all this stuff we talked about, how spiritual systems can go bad.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a textbook example.
And Gabbard grew up in this environment. It's mind-blowing.
It really is. Makes you think about the long-term effects of this kind of upbringing.
It does. And, speaking of effects, our sources mention these manipulative tactics that SIF uses.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, stuff like love bombing, NLP, and triangulation.
Okay, hold up. Those are some serious accusations. Those sound like straight out of a psychology textbook.
I know, right? And the thing is, it's not just SIF that uses these tactics. It's like a common thread among these manipulative groups.
Oh, absolutely. Love bombing is like classic cult behavior. They shower you with love and attention so you feel like you belong, And it makes it harder to see the red flags.
Yeah, they prey on that human need for connection, right? And then there's NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, which, it's not inherently bad, right?
No, not at all. It can be used for good, like in therapy,
Right. But in the context of a group like SIF, where control is key, it could be used to influence people without them even realizing it.
Yeah, it's like they're hacking into your mind.
And then there's triangulation, where they use third parties to relay messages, so you never know where the information is really coming from.
Exactly. It creates this environment of distrust and confusion, and people start doubting their own perceptions.
Wow, it's like they're being gaslighted.
It is a form of gaslighting, absolutely.
And then if you add in that excerpt from traumabusecults.pdf about shame being used as a tool of manipulation.
It's scary stuff.
It is, and it makes you wonder about the long-term psychological impact on the members.
Yeah, I mean, if the leader is constantly projecting their own shame onto the followers, it can really mess with their sense of self-worth.
And make them more likely to just blindly follow the rules, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got all this concerning information about Sif, but then there's this excerpt from Keeping Faith with Katuri that takes a different perspective on things.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it talks about the importance of spiritual lineages and taking refuge in a community, which seems like it could be a positive thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, every group needs some kind of structure and tradition, and this source suggests that the devotion we see in SIF might come from a genuine belief in the teachings and respect for the tradition. But how do we reconcile that with all the red flags about control and manipulation? It's like we're seeing two different sides of the same coin.
It's definitely complex, and I think this is a good time to ask our listeners a question. How do you decide if a spiritual teaching or a leader is legitimate? What would you look for to tell if a community is genuine or if it's exploiting its members? That's a great question, and one we should all be asking ourselves, especially in today's world where there are so many spiritual offerings out there.
It's like a spiritual buffet.
Right, but how do we know which dishes are nourishing and which ones might make us sick?
Exactly.
And speaking of things that might make us sick, we need to talk about QNet.
Oh, yeah, the multi-level marketing company.
Right, and it's connected to SIF through this guy, Joseph Bismarck, also known as Japa Das.
I'm familiar with him. He's a pretty prominent figure in SIF.
He is, and QNet has been accused of some pretty shady stuff.
Like what?
Well, we've got reports of arrests in Indonesia, fatwas in Egypt, and legal action in India.
Oh, okay, that's serious.
It is, and it all points to allegations of financial impropriety, like they're not playing by the rules.
So what's a respected spiritual leader like Bismarck doing mixed up in a company like that?
I know, right? It's a head scratcher. And then there's this anecdote about Bismarck at this QNet event, the V Convention.
Oh, yeah. What happened?
Well, picture this. Bismarck sitting on a Tecturo troni, which basically means a cardboard throne.
A cardboard throne?
Yeah.
You're kidding.
No, it's true. And it's like the irony is palpable.
It's almost comical.
It is, and it makes you question everything, right? Like, is Bismarck just a pawn in Q Knight's game, or is there something more calculated going on?
Yeah, it's a mystery that we're going to have to unpack.
Exactly, and we're going to do that in the next part of our deep dive, so stick around, because this story is just getting started. Okay, so we left off talking about QNet and Joseph Bismarck, or Japa Das, right? This big guy in SEF, and he's like super involved with this company, and they're facing some serious accusations.
Yeah, it's tough to like wrap your head around.
Yeah.
You know, you got this image of a spiritual leader, but then you have these allegations of like financial exploitation.
Yeah, it's like one of those optical illusions where you see different things depending on how you look at it.
It is a bit of a puzzle for sure.
Yeah.
I think it really highlights what we're talking about with these groups. You know, the potential for manipulation. Like we were saying earlier, love bombing. You know, they shower potential recruits with all this attention and affection. It's like they fast track these intense bonds.
Yeah.
And that makes it even harder for people to see those warning signs.
Right. It totally preys on that need for connection we all have, right? Like being accepted.
Exactly.
And then there's NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, which isn't bad in itself, right?
Oh, no, not at all.
Like it can be used for good, like in therapy and stuff.
Right, exactly.
But when you're talking about a group like SIF, where control is like everything NLP could be used to influence people without them even knowing it.
It's true. You know, it's like they're hacking into your mind.
It is. And then you add in what we saw in those Polish sources, triangulation.
Oh, yeah. Using other people to give messages.
Right. So you can never tell where the information is coming from.
Exactly. It creates this whole atmosphere of uncertainty and distrust. So people start to question what they believe.
It's like they're being gaslighted.
It is gaslighting. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then on top of that, we have that excerpt from traumabusecults.pdf that talks about using shame as a manipulation tool.
Ugh, it's just awful.
I know, and it makes you think about the damage it does to these people.
Oh, yeah, the psychological impact can be huge.
If the leader is like always putting their own shame onto their followers,
right,
it can really mess them up. Like their self-worth goes down the drain.
It makes them more likely to just follow blindly, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've got all this concerning stuff about SIF, right? But then we also have this excerpt from Keeping Faith with Katuri, and it has this whole other view of things. It talks about spiritual lineages,
Right.
you know, and the importance of taking refuge in a community, which sounds good.
It does.
Yeah.
I mean, every group needs some kind of structure, some tradition, right?
Right.
And this source is saying that the devotion we see in SIF, maybe it's because they really believe the teachings, and they respect the tradition.
But how do you square that with everything else we've seen? You know, all those red flags about control and manipulation.
It's tough, isn't it? It's like two sides of the same coin.
It is.
And I think this is a good time to ask our listeners what they think,
Yeah.
How do you figure out if a spiritual leader or teaching is the real deal? Like, what do you look for to know if a community is genuine or if they're taking advantage of people?
That's a great question. I think it's something we all need to think about,
Hey.
Especially now when there are so many spiritual groups out there.
It's like a buffet.
It is, how do we know which food will nourish us and which will make us sick?
Exactly.
Speaking of things that might make us sick, let's talk about those former member accounts.
Oh, right. They're pretty intense.
They are. They talk about being isolated and the pressure to conform and the fear of what will happen if you don't follow the rules.
Those are some serious accusations.
Yeah, and these accounts are important because they show us how being in this group affects people, like emotionally and psychologically.
That isolation tactic, that's classic cult stuff.
Yeah.
Creating that us versus them feeling,
It's like they're in a bubble separated from everyone else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It keeps them under control, stops them from getting outside perspectives.
Right, and then they pile on all these rules like what you wear, what you eat, who you can talk to. It's a lot.
It is. It's like their whole life is dictated by the group.
And then you add the potential for shame and punishment. It's no wonder these former members say they have problems with their mental health,
Yeah.
anxiety, PTSD, even depression.
It's a lot to carry.
It is. It's a heavy price to pay for spiritual guidance. And it brings us back to that question of discernment. How do we know who to trust?
It's the million-dollar question, right?
It is, especially when everyone's saying they have the answers.
Right.
Like, we haven't even gotten to the possible link between Seth and QNet's recruitment.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other layer.
It's almost too much to wrap your head around.
I think the key is just to stay curious, Keep asking questions. Don't take things at face value.
Be skeptical.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions.
That's good advice for anything, really, not just this.
True. That we need to be careful with information, Look at it from different angles, try to figure out people's motivations.
And remember, even in a group like SIF, there are people with their own stories, their own experiences.
That's important to remember.
So let's talk about that connection between SIF and QNet. We've got Bismarck, this prominent figure in SIF, and he's wrapped up in this company that's been accused of some pretty shady stuff.
Right.
What do you make of that, considering what we've learned about SIF and their potential for manipulation?
It's a tough one, isn't it? Like, is Bismarck a victim himself?
Yeah.
Maybe he got sucked in by the promises of wealth and success, didn't realize what he was getting into.
Or maybe he's in on it, using his position in SIF to recruit people for QNet, taking advantage of their trust.
It's possible. And we can't forget that picture of him on the cardboard throne at that QNet event.
Yeah, the V convention.
It's hard to believe someone who's truly detached from material things would be okay with that,
Right. It makes you question his teachings, doesn't it? Like, is this all about personal gain for him?
It could be, but we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions.
Of course, we don't have any proof that he's done anything wrong.
Right.
But the connection between SIF and QNet, it's definitely interesting.
It is something to keep in mind as we go forward.
And we can't ignore the fact that Tulsi Gabbard was raised in SIF.
Right. A former U.S. representative.
Yeah, and she's still a practicing member. That's a pretty big link to politics, wouldn't you say?
Definitely adds a whole new layer to this whole thing.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder how growing up in SIF shaped her views.
Yeah, like, did she experience the same pressures to conform, the same isolation from the outside world?
Exactly. And how do her political goals line up with what SIF teaches?
Right. Are there any conflicts of interest?
It's a lot to think about. It's a reminder that these groups, they don't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
They can have a big impact on society, both good and bad.
So where do we go from here? We've got all this information, right? Different perspectives, connections, allegations. It's a lot.
I think the most important thing is to keep asking questions.
Stay curious.
Exactly. And be skeptical. Don't just take things at face value.
We have to be critical with information.
Right. Look for patterns.
Uh-huh.
Try to understand what motivates people.
And remember compassion.
Yeah,
Even in a group like SIF, there are people with their own unique experiences and stories.
absolutely.
So let's look at some of those personal accounts now,
Yeah.
especially the ones about how SIF uses yoga, as a way to recruit people.
Right. Like we talked about those hatha yoga classes.
Yeah, they're super popular, and most people see yoga as just a way to get fit and de-stress.
Right.
But could SIF be using it as a way to introduce people to their beliefs?
Like a Trojan horse, right?
Yeah, you go in for a good stretch, and next thing you know, you're being exposed to all these ideas you weren't even looking for.
It's sneaky.
It is, and it makes you realize how important it is to be aware of the context, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, is it really just a yoga studio or is there something else going on?
Right. What are their real intentions?
Exactly.
And this brings us to something really difficult to talk about.
The child abuse allegations.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. Our sources have some truly heartbreaking stories from former members.
I know, it's hard to even imagine those things happening in a place that's supposed to be about spirituality and peace.
They're alleging physical abuse, emotional abuse, even sexual abuse of children.
It's just awful, and we have to take these accusations very seriously.
We do, and it's important to remember that these are allegations at this point. We
Right.
don't want to jump to conclusions.
Of course, but the fact that these accounts are so consistent and so serious, it's definitely something that needs to be looked into.
And our sources also say that SIF might be covering up these allegations.
Oh, wow.
Like silencing the people who speak out.
If that's true, it's just adding another layer of betrayal.
It is. It makes you question their commitment to protecting the vulnerable.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even in groups that talk about love and peace, there can be darkness.
And it shows how important it is to speak up,
Absolutely.
to hold the leaders accountable and to create safe spaces for survivors to share their stories.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about money, the financial side of SIF.
Okay.
Our sources give us some info on how they get their money and manage it, and one thing that keeps coming up is donations.
Right, they encourage members to give financially.
Yeah, often at great personal cost. But are these donations really voluntary? Or is there pressure involved?
That's the question, right?
Yeah, because our sources suggest there can be a lot of pressure to give. And if you don't give enough, you might face consequences, socially or spiritually.
It blurs the line between generosity and coercion.
Right. It's like, is it a suggestion or an expectation? And then you have SIF's businesses, like the down-to-earth stores.
Right.
It all adds up to a pretty complicated financial situation.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder about transparency and accountability.
Exactly. Are they using the money responsibly? Or are there questions about misuse?
It's a valid concern.
And it reminds us that even in spiritual groups, money is still a thing.
It is. We need to be aware of that and look for signs of any shady business.
Hold them accountable for how they're managing their resources.
Right.
Okay, so we've got these financial questions, and then we circle back to SIF's political influence.
Yeah.
We know about Tulsi Gabbard's connection, but our sources also mentioned that SIF members have donated to political campaigns,
Yeah.
and some have even held positions in government.
Wow.
It makes you think about conflicts of interest,
Yeah.
Like, is SIF using its resources to push a specific agenda?
It's a tricky subject, this whole religion and politics thing.
It is.
On the one hand, people in religious groups have the right to participate in politics just like anyone else.
Of course.
But when an organization with a lot of money and power starts pushing a specific agenda, it can be a problem.
Right. It's like they could be exerting undue influence. And speaking of influence, we need to talk about SIF's views on women.
Okay.
Our sources say their teachings emphasize that women should be subservient to men.
Really?
Yeah, both in the family and in the organization.
That's pretty outdated.
It clashes with modern ideas about equality,
For sure.
and it raises concerns about sexism and discrimination within SIF.
Yeah. How do women in the group deal with that?
Exactly. Are they forced to suppress who they are?
It makes you wonder.
It does, and this idea of individual expression versus group conformity,
Yeah.
it keeps coming up in our discussion about SIF.
It's central tension, isn't it?
It is. So what do you think the future holds for SIF? Will they keep growing, or will they start to face some challenges?
It's hard to say for sure, but based on what we've learned, it seems like they're at a crossroads.
Yeah, like on one hand, they've been successful for a long time,
Hmm.
built a loyal following, have a lot of money, political connections.
Right. But on the other hand, they're under more scrutiny now with those allegations of financial problems,
Yeah.
child abuse, manipulation, their views on women.
Will they be able to survive all that?
Only time will tell, I guess,
Yeah.
but it's clear that the stakes are high.
They are, whatever happens, it's going to have a big impact on a lot of people.
Absolutely.
So it's important for us to stay informed, keep asking questions, share information, hold these groups accountable.
Couldn't agree more. And as we head into the final part of our deep dive, let's take a closer look at some of the more nuanced aspects of SIF's teachings.
Okay.
Their approach to yoga, their focus on spiritual development, what they believe about social and ethical issues.
Okay, so we're back, and wow, this deep dive into SIF, it's been a wild ride.
It has been a lot to take in, hasn't it?
Yeah, we started with basic cult definitions, then went to financial stuff, child abuse, and now we're going to look at some of their actual teachings.
It is a lot, and this part I think is important because it gets to the core of why people join SIF in the first place.
Right.
Their whole approach to yoga and how they see spiritual development.
Okay, yeah, we talked about those hatha yoga classes before as a way to recruit people, but let's get into it a little more.
Okay.
Our sources mention this breathing technique, pranayama garanga, that seems to be pretty central to their practice. Have you ever heard of that?
Pranayama garanga. It's not something I'm super familiar with.
Really?
Yeah, it's not really found in traditional yoga lineages. So it makes me think that SAF either came up with it themselves or maybe they adapted it from something more obscure.
So it's like their own unique thing.
It seems that way, and that's something we've seen a lot with SAF.
Yeah.
They take bits and pieces from different traditions, but then they shape it into something that's distinctly SAF.
Like their own brand of spirituality.
Exactly, and they really emphasize spiritual development, sometimes even over traditional education.
Like school and stuff?
Yeah, our sources suggest they encourage members to focus on their spiritual growth and service to the organization. Sometimes that means putting aside their education.
Wow, that's interesting. So what happens to people who leave SUF?
It can be tough.
Yeah. Yeah.
They might have trouble fitting into regular society, getting jobs, making friends outside of SIF.
It's like they've been living in a bubble.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about some of SIF's beliefs on social issues, things like sexuality.
Okay.
Seems like they have pretty conservative views.
In what way?
Well, they emphasize things like abstinence before marriage and fidelity after you're married.
That's going to resonate with some people, but not others.
Yeah, especially now when things are more liberal.
It's true. And their views on homosexuality are especially problematic.
Yeah. What do they say about that?
Well, according to our sources, SIF considers it a sin, and they discourage any kind of same-sex intimacy.
Wow, that's really harmful.
It is. It contributes to stigma and discrimination against LGBTQ plus people.
Yeah, and it goes against all the progress we've made towards inclusivity and accepting people for who they are.
Absolutely.
So what about their views on other things like race, environmentalism, technology?
It's a mixed bag, to be honest.
Must too.
Well, they seem to be genuinely committed to environmentalism. Promoting vegetarianism, sustainable living, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But their focus is more on individual responsibility, not really addressing the systemic issues.
So it's like, change yourself and the world will follow.
Yeah, but it ignores the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Things like corporate greed and government policies that are actually causing the problem.
That's a very limited view.
Yeah. And when it comes to race, our sources suggest some pretty disturbing stuff.
Like what?
They seem to promote racial segregation and discourage interracial relationships.
That's messed up.
It shows that even groups that talk about spirituality can still hold on to prejudiced and discriminatory beliefs.
So much for enlightenment.
Right. And then with technology, it seems like they're cautious.
How so?
Well, they recognize that technology has benefits, but they also warn about the dangers.
Makes sense.
Yeah, they encourage people to use technology wisely and responsibly.
That's good advice for everyone, really.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into SIF, I think it's important to remember that they're complicated.
Yeah.
We've seen signs of potential manipulation and harm, but we've also seen things that people might find appealing, about spiritual growth and connection.
It's not black and white.
It's not.
It's up to each person to decide if SIF is right for them.
Weigh the risks and benefits.
Exactly. And think about what's important to them.
And it goes back to that question we asked earlier.
About discernment.
Right. How do we tell the difference between real spiritual wisdom and teachings that are just trying to control us?
It's a question we all need to keep asking.
There's no easy answer.
There isn't. But we can learn to be more critical, to think for ourselves and challenge our own biases.
Well said. So that's it for our deep dive into the Science of Identity Foundation.
I hope this has been insightful for everyone.
Yeah, even though it's been heavy at times.
It has, but knowledge is power.
It is, and by understanding these issues, we can make better choices for ourselves.
Absolutely.
Mm?
So thank you for joining us.
And keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.